didn't at one time live in Norfolk? Everybody's from Norfolk. Oh, good, good. Yeah. No? No, okay. Well, we'll let you in. We'll let you in.
But you have to say Norfolk, not Norfolk. Norfolk. Norfolk.
Oh, you hear it both ways nowadays.
It's whatever you want to call it, I don't care.
We always start a fight about that.
We're going to start with a little activity to test your brain activity. It's going to be very easy for you guys, so don't worry about it. There's no one's going to get kicked out of the room if they miss one, anything like that. Back in March of 2023, last year is when I came to Norfolk, went to Norfolk. I'm in Lincoln, right? Okay. I went to Norfolk and I did 6 presentations there. I met Joe Kramer there at the VFW, and it was a very successful book tour, and met a lot of old friends. I graduated from Norfolk High in 1970. We do have in our midst at least one Norfolk Catholic graduate, Joe Francis. Oh, we have others, okay. We're not going to hold that against him.
We won't.
Anyway, we can do some Norfolk jokes because it's just mostly Norfolk people here. But one of the groups I presented to on the last day I was in Norfolk, I wanted to go up to the senior high school where I graduated from, and I had 80 sophomore students in the Johnny Carson Auditorium who had not taken a U.S. history class. Well, they were taking U.S. history, but they hadn't studied Vietnam yet. That was going to come in sometime in April, I guess. I hope it did. So I thought, I taught for 36 years, high school students. So I thought, how am I going to get these people engaged who don't know probably anything about the war? And so I came up with this activity that we're going to do right now, if I can get the projector to work and everything like that. And they didn't do too well. But it allowed me to introduce them to some people and to talk about the war a bit before I started talking about the book. The subject of the book, The Last Full Measure, it's got a longer title than that, but that comes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The last full measure of devotion are those who died at Gettysburg for the Union cause. And this is about the 9 men from Norfolk who died in Vietnam. So I'll talk more about that book after we do the activity, and hopefully I won't drive anybody out of the room. I think you're all going to get A's. B's. Yeah, you'll do better than sophomores did, I'm sure.
Do we get $1 for every
You'll have to talk to your parents. My parents didn't do that. So anyway, the way this works is I'm going to show a slide. Most of these are people. And I'm going to say, don't yell out the answer. There's no $1 for yelling the answer out before anybody else. Just raise your hand if you think you know who this is. And yeah, it was an interesting experience with the 80 sophomores. But they were very eager to participate. They didn't do too well, but they just kept trying, so I appreciated that. So, first slide, if you think you know who this is, just raise your hand. Tough one. Tough one. And the amazing thing, I thought, probably 35, what? Oh, I probably don't need one.
Yeah.
The amazing thing to me was probably 35% of the sophomores knew who this was. I should have followed up and asked them, how do you know this is JFK? Well, he's kind of a celebrity president, I think that's probably it. And he had a handsome son, John Jr., and all that kind of stuff. And the Kennedys worked really hard to maintain that, public persona and all of that. But they knew that was John F. Kennedy, and most of them just yelled out, JFK! So as you look at this, you can see there's a map behind Kennedy. This is a press conference, I believe in 1961, his first year in office. And he's not talking about Vietnam. He's talking, it's kind of out of focus, but he's talking about Laos. That was his concern. The Pathet Lao, the communists in Laos. And then off to the side here, you can see Hanoi. You can see North Vietnam, but he's actually talking about Laos. That was his concern at this point. As time goes on, of course, we all know what happens, and that's Kennedy's concern turns to Vietnam in a big way. One of the, still a debate among historians is, and you probably maybe participated in this debate as well, over a couple of beers maybe. I don't know if you women drink beer, maybe you did. But what would Kennedy have done had he not been assassinated in regards to Vietnam? And there's a whole movie based on this. It's part of the thread in the JFK movie. Oliver Stone was a Vietnam vet, and he thought Kennedy would not have stayed in Vietnam like the next guy did. I must blew the next slide. But that's conjecture. We don't know. What we do know is that the major advisors that advised the next president on Vietnam, which led to escalation, they were Kennedy men. Every one of them. So, I don't know. It's one of those questions that you get when you study history. Okay. Now, I'm not going to ask you to identify every one of those soldiers. So, but I use this to illustrate in one slide, if it's possible, it's not, but illustrate Kennedy's policy. And the kids are looking at this, the sophomore students, and they said, what do you notice about the soldiers on the ground? And one of them came up with what I thought was kind of a brilliant answer. Are they kids? That's pretty astute. And of course, no, they're not kids. Those are South Vietnamese soldiers, ARVN, right? Our allies. And so Kennedy's approach was to, as much as possible, the South Vietnamese would fight the war, and we would supply things like a helicopter, and maybe even the helicopter pilots, and the training for the pilots, and maybe the uniforms, all good for U.S. industries, right? But that was his approach, and he was having some real questions about even that policy. We do know, we'll look at some graphs later on in this slideshow, and we do know that when he took office, there were around 3,500 Americans that were part of the military aid and assistance group in Vietnam. That was allowed under treaty. And when he left office abruptly, there were 16,500. But officially, they were not combat troops, officially. We know some of them were flying combat missions, taking Vietnamese troops into battle, and probably firing on the enemy, and some of them got killed. So that was happening during the Kennedy administration. But I really thought that comment from the kid, are those kids? Are those soldiers kids? It was pretty good. Okay, if you know who this person is, raise your hand. You just came in. This is too simple. Yeah, he's a worried man, isn't he? Look at the furrows in that brow. And of course, that's Kennedy's successor, Johnson. If you know anything about Johnson at all, you know that he was not a foreign policy expert. He was brought into the Kennedy administration to run as JFK's running mate. They had really not much in common. Kennedy was from a high-class society family, and Johnson was from Texas. And but Johnson came in because he was, during his time in the Senate, he became the master of the Senate. He knew how to get legislation passed through the Congress. and he also was from the South. And the Democrats were worried about losing the South. It had been a Democratic stronghold, losing it over the issue of civil rights. So he chose Lyndon Johnson, and then suddenly, on November 22nd, 1963, I'm sure you all remember that day and what you were doing. I was a sixth grader at Grant School. I'm sure you all have your stories.
Yeah.
And suddenly Johnson's president. And one of the problems confronting him is Vietnam, which is growing in importance. And just 2 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated, the president of South Vietnam and his brother were assassinated by generals. Shocked the Kennedy administration. They just thought there was going to be a change of government. I know there's been some conjecture that the Kennedys knew they would be killed all along, but I don't think there's strong evidence for that. But the generals just decided, well, we'll just get rid of this problem once and for all, and they killed him after they captured him. So you had in Vietnam, South Vietnam, a revolving door government for a while. Some of the governments lasted weeks, some lasted months. It wasn't until 1965 they ran across this guy named Nguyen Van Tu, who was there till the very end. But he was a former general also, who put on a business suit, right? So Johnson, this is his big problem that basically drives him from office. You might remember in March of 1968, Johnson went on TV to talk about peace in Vietnam, and at the end of the speech he said, "I will not be running for my party's nomination." And he withdrew. 68, of course, you might recall. Was anybody in Vietnam in 68? Yeah. Terrible year. Tet Offensive, 2 more offensives, lots of casualties. That's considered to be the peak of the war, 68 and 69. And that goes a long way to basically explaining Johnson's choice to get out of the White House. And he said, I want to concentrate on peace in Vietnam. But of course, when he didn't run for re-election, he lost some of his negotiating power. He's going to be gone. We don't have to negotiate with this guy. Okay, this next one is going to be easy. Who's this guy? Looks like a profile of the same guy, yeah. This is Johnson on his tour of Vietnam when he was president, proudly pinning a medal on anybody identify that unit? Is the 82nd Airborne? Like, yeah, I think so. Anyway, I use this to illustrate Johnson took great pride in the beginning. He took great pride being president and being commander-in-chief. He did not serve in the military in World War II. He was in the Congress. My favorite story in this regard, it's my favorite, it may not be your favorite. We'll see. Johnson goes to Vietnam and there's a whole lot of helicopters land and he gets out of one of them and he goes up and he's meeting the troops. And this young private says to him, shaking his hand, and says, Mr. President, he's looking over at all these helicopters, which helicopter is yours? And Johnson put his hand on the man's shoulder, said, they're all my helicopters. So he enjoyed being commander-in-chief, taking ownership of that. And of course, later on, he didn't enjoy it very much. Whoops. What's that? I thought something like this would happen. Okay, that was Now this is a tough one. Since you're looking at the top of somebody's head, it's a little difficult maybe to figure out who this is. It is Johnson, yes. And the reason I wanted to show this is, I'll explain the photograph. I had to ask the sophomore students if they could tell me what this was. And they actually could. That's an old tape recorder. How many of you guys who are in the military went to the PX and bought something like this because it was cheap, right? Now, I know my brother had the big reel-to-reel one, but you could get stereo equipment there, cameras, all that kind of stuff. But this is Johnson listening to a tape. This tape was sent to him by one of his son-in-laws. He had two son-in-laws, two daughters. What were their names? Linda and Lucy, I believe. And their husbands went to Vietnam. And I believe this was the tape sent home. Johnson asked each of them to make tapes rather than try to write a letter. I want a long tape. You tell me what you see, what's going on. So he wanted to be informed, and some of the stories have written he had so much information at the time that it was paralyzing. So he would just turn to the Joint Chiefs and say, what do I do? He's listening to a tape sent to him by, I think it's Chuck Robb. And the story behind the tape and this photo, if you look at Johnson's hands, they're kind of white knuckled, right? He's got his glasses off, he's listening to an attack on Chuck Robb's camp. Robb had started doing the letter home, and then suddenly the VC struck the camp. Robb, I'm sure, grabbed his weapon and his helmet and took off for a bunker and left it running, not on purpose, just to get out of there. And so he's listening to this attack and agonizing over what he hears. So I think it's a mistake to say, well, Johnson didn't know what was going on, Johnson wasn't informed, Johnson didn't care about the troops. I don't think that's it at all. He just didn't have a lot of experience in foreign affairs and made his decisions based on what he thought was the best advice he got. One of the things in my book I talk about is the war. I try to put each of these 9 men's stories and their time in Vietnam. They were there from 66 clear into 71 at various times. Put their service in context of what the bigger picture was. And so I do talk about Kennedy and I do talk about Johnson. And of course I'm offering the reader my interpretation. So you're free to disagree with it if you want to. But yeah, I think Johnson he's responsible for the escalation. And it was very rapid escalation. And I know some of you got caught up in that through the draft or the pressure of the draft. You decided you would enlist. And some of you enlisted because you believed in the cause. But, and then many of us, like myself, I graduated in 1970. We have a new president. The war's winding down. We're getting out. And I'd gone to college 1 year before I was up for the Nixon lottery. So I already had a college deferment. And my number in the draft was 263. So I was pretty sure I was safe from having to be drafted. My brother, on the other hand, he attended college for 4 years, had not graduated yet, but even if he had graduated, the draft, before the Nixon era draft, you were eligible from age 19 to 27, I believe it was. They could pick you any one of those years. And so you had a four-year deferment. When that was over, he was informed you're going to be drafted. Our dad was a World War II combat medic of the 101st Airborne Division. General supported the war, supported the presidents. But he told Rex, maybe you should join the Air Force. And that's what he did. And that was a 4-year term, right?
Yeah.
And so I talked to several people who made that choice, thinking they were told by the recruiters, you'll have more options. Well, yes and no. If they needed you, they exercised their option, right, where they were going to send you. My brother went to Turkey for his overseas thing, but he could have gone to Vietnam. Some of his friends in basic training and AIT went to Vietnam. Okay, I think we're on to a new person. Who is this man?
McNamara.
Okay. Should have said his name. That's okay. Robert McNamara, you all are going to get that right. In fact, some of us have such strong feelings about him that during the Iraq War, we looked at the Secretary of Defense there and we went, he's just like McNamara. Rumsfeld, right? He had that air about him. But McNamara became a very controversial person. He's one of the Kennedy guys. I don't know if you've read The Best and the Brightest about the Kennedy administration. Kennedy was sort of an intellectual, I guess you say. And he went out and had connections to the elites, and Robert McNamara was the guy who turned Ford Motor Company around. He also was a World War II analyst, bombing analyst. And of course, there is going to be a step up in the air campaign in Vietnam, and he's going to be analyzing those results. We know now, we didn't know when McNamara was Secretary of Defense, that by 1967 he was having serious doubts about his own policy. And so Johnson's challenge was to find him a job outside of government and also make sure he didn't go to the press with all his misgivings. And he didn't. He was a good soldier. So finally in February of '68, Robert McNamara left the White House, and the job that President Johnson found for him was a pretty good one. McNamara became president of the World Bank. Not bad, not bad. He also got the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a White House ceremony. But he stayed silent until years later he finally wrote a book. And see, I've got probably, let's see, April of 1995, he finally came forward with his book and talked about how he began to doubt his policies were working in Vietnam. But the public didn't know that. It was known within the administration, not the public. I actually had a kid, I did 2 presentations to Chevron High School students. I taught in Chevron for 27 years. And so I went back and talked to a couple of U.S. history classes there, and I actually had a kid who identified every one of these people, including McNamara. And afterwards he came up to me. He was a son of a student that I had taught 20 years earlier. And I said, so you're a history nerd? Yes, I am. So that was amazing, I thought. So that's McNamara.
Thank you.
Okay, if you'll raise your hand. Okay? There's some pretty good clues here. Pretty good clues if you can just read the signs. There's that smile. I think I barely heard it, but I think I heard somebody saying it. Did somebody say tricky dick? Yeah. Just about every one of my presentations to adults, when I put this up here, I hear somebody say they know they're not supposed to blur out the answer. I hear them say, that's tricky dick. Yeah, imagine being saddled with that moniker, you know. Yeah, he, the election of 1968, some of my students imagined that I was a hippie in the 60s, and it was just a great time. And when I taught history during that section of the history course, I'd have to tell them, no, it was not a fun and games at all. We need to study this. And of course, 68 was a tumultuous year, one of the most tumultuous years in history. And of course, Nixon became the candidate of the Republican Party. This is, when you think about it, Nixon's comeback is the greatest political comeback probably in American history. Any era. He loses in 1960 to JFK, right? Close election. His people wanted him to contest it. He didn't. He thought it would tear the country apart. 2 years later, he ran for the governor of California. He was defeated by Pat Brown. And there was another famous Nixon quote. He told the press, he blamed the media for losing that election, and said, boys, you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. And of course, 6 years later, he's running for his party's nomination. He sweeps to the nomination and then wins against Hubert Humphrey in a very close election, which I didn't remember it as being close, but I think I was thinking of 72, which was a rout. Nixon won 49 states in 1972 against George McGovern. But it was actually a close election, what I find surprising, because Hubert Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and he was kind of shackled to Johnson's Vietnam policy, which many voters felt was a failed policy. So Nixon comes in. This next one is going to be easy also. Yeah, he knows. He had a very, what would be the right word? His profile was hard to miss, that nose. And of course, political cartoonists had a field day with it. I remember being a smart, maybe smart-ass guy in college. The poster, Richard Nixon, classic pose. Would you buy a used car from this man? You know? So anyway, he ended up having his own problems later on, but he was the Vietnam president. He considered himself, unlike Johnson, he considered himself to be an expert in foreign policy. In many ways, he was. He'd been, vice president for Eisenhower for 2 years at a young age. And he came in well steeped in foreign policy. And if you think about some of the things he was doing, improving relations with the Soviet Union, détente. The trip to China, Red China. And back in the 50s, he was blasting anyone who supported, or anyone who questioned the nationalist Chinese as communists, right? And then in his first administration, he was going to China. He thought he could use the pressure from China and the Soviet Union to pressure the North Vietnamese to give on negotiations. We know there are tapes where Nixon is talking to Henry Kissinger. Those two were kind of almost by themselves in planning U.S. foreign policy and Vietnam policy. And they believed, this was before Nixon took office, that they could have the negotiations done in 6 months. I think part of that was they underestimated the North Vietnamese. Tough people. And they were communists. There was not a democracy, right, that we were negotiating with. But of course, it didn't happen in 6 months, and it happened just before Nixon took over for his second term in 1973. Is there anybody in Vietnam in 1973? That was an interesting development, though. Suddenly, they kept the lid on it pretty good from Paris, and I think it was dated January 15th, 1973. Nixon, of course, one of his mantras during the time before that was peace with honor. He was concerned about our POWs and accounting for those who were missing in action. And one of the things, I don't know, has anybody visited the Nixon Library and Museum out in California? One of the main exhibits was about the POWs and the release of the POWs. It was very fascinating. I thought it was the best part of the whole exhibit. He took great pride in that. So he got us out, but for a lot of people who had turned against the war, he couldn't get us out fast enough. You know? So there were still lots of protests, things like that, that I know might have been disconcerting to veterans, people who were over in Vietnam. Okay. We're almost done. This part. This illustrates the troop levels in Vietnam from 64 to 72. And you can see how quickly it ballooned. And that's 64 to 68. That's Johnson's administration. Now, most of these guys are not involved in combat. How many of you were in combat? In Vietnam. Okay. The general figure you hear is anywhere from 10 to 15% were directly engaged in combat, but the other was support, some sort of support personnel. Everything, I have a friend who worked for the post office. We were mailed to soldiers. So not everybody was in combat. Another guy I know who worked in an air-conditioned office, didn't carry a weapon around, didn't have to do any of that. He was with G2 Intelligence. His brother, this is Phil Arkfeld, his brother Bill visited him. Bill was a Marine, and he came in all cameled up with his M16. He goes, "Where's your rifle, little brother? We don't need one here." So you had various kinds of jobs in South Vietnam. So of course, if you were in South Vietnam, you could be sitting in a bar at Saigon or whatnot, right? So you really weren't safe anywhere. But you can see the peak number is just the early part of '69. You have troops still coming in as Nixon's going to come. It's 538 something is the peak. I think that's actually was in April of '69. And then Nixon begins the drawdown. A couple of terms you may remember. I talked about peace with honor. You may remember that term as he talked about it all the time. And that proved to be elusive and frustrating. The other was Vietnamization. And that was to describe the South Vietnamese army to take over a greater and greater percentage of the military effort, which is what happened. Incidentally, if you go back in the 50s, the French did the same thing. It was called the yellowing, whatever that is in French. As they left Vietnam, South Vietnam, I guess it was all of Vietnam, they turned the military effort more and more to Vietnamese troops who were loyal to the French government. You can see the last year we were fully in is 1972, and the withdrawal happened very quickly. I don't know if you remember this, but some of the scenes you might remember from the withdrawal days are the helicopters being pushed off the decks of aircraft carriers. These helicopters, or South Vietnamese helicopters, are what? Refugees out, people who are now refugees. You might remember the scenes from the U.S. Embassy of, very sad scenes of desperate people trying to get in. The last people out of there, of course, were U.S. Marines who were guarding the embassy. And a couple of guys thought they got left behind on the roof. And fortunately, somebody figured it out and they came back and got them, right? But that's the ending in Vietnam. There's been some criticism of our withdrawal from Afghanistan, and some of you, maybe all of you, share that criticism. It's easy, I think it's understandable. But then I think of Vietnam, and of course it was a much bigger problem then. And that wasn't pretty either. It was pretty ugly. And then some of you may have met during your course of your lifetime, you may have met the so-called Vietnamese boat people who moved to your community and made a life for themselves. Lots of refugees. So that shows you in a graphic way I want you to see this one because you can see there's a course, as you might expect, as our number of troops increases, the number of deaths in Vietnam also increases. And the critical point, if you read histories, and you probably know this if you lived through it, is what happened in '68 with the Tet offensives. And there were two more offensives. They all failed militarily. The VC got wiped out. It changed the character of the war. More and more these troops had to come down into South Vietnam because the VC were not a very effective fighting force. They were still a guerrilla force, but not an effective fighting force. But when I talk about these 9 guys that are the subjects of my book, 5 of the 9 died in '68 and '69. And this, it kind of mirrors these statistics. And I'm sure you served in Vietnam, you had buddies who died in the war, you knew people who died in the war. How many of you have been to the Memorial Park up in Papillion? Yeah, that's probably why you're not on the bus today, right? Yeah, it's a great way to honor the veterans of Nebraska. I went there in June, on June 6th, for the dedication. Some of you were probably there too. And very very moving. And the amount of effort to bring that off, it's a beautiful place. Very well done. I don't know if you've ever seen this photo. This is from a book called The Wall. And most of the photos were taken the day of the dedication, which I think was in 1982. Was anybody there in 1982? I've known a couple of people who went there in 1982 for the original dedication. And they have ceremonies there every year after that. But I just thought that captured the moment for some people. It's quite overwhelming. When I went there, I've been there 3 times. People are quiet. They're reflective. Some people are crying, even today. So this was a memorial. The design was hotly debated. It was ugly. It didn't honor the veterans, and the people who organized this project and had it funded. It's largely private donations. The Park Service donated the land. That was pretty much it. And they stuck with their plans. And for a lot of people, it's an iconic symbol of the war. Very interesting design as well. These are the subjects in my book. These are the service photos of the 9 men from Norfolk who died in Vietnam. I devote a chapter to each one. There's a prologue in the book. There's the book. And then when I started this, I didn't know if I'd have enough information to do a chapter for each of these individuals. I wanted to, and I was able to find enough information to do that. So my hope is that these won't be just names on the wall. That people, primarily it's local interest, people from Norfolk, but others who are interested in the subject, will feel like when they've finished the chapter on this particular individual, they'll know almost like, I can say almost like I knew her. And I've been told I've been successful in that regard. So these are the guys. I'm going to do a kind of a quick rundown talking about these men. I'm going to be staying in the way here. I'll shout a little bit away from the mic.
You can pull the mic out of the stand if you want.
Oh, I'd probably start singing.
That's okay.
Telling jokes.
We'll forgive you.
Oh, I can't. This is big time. One of the things I forgot, I had handouts so you could see this slide. You can get one if you want to after the deal. Staff Sergeant Dennis Anderson on that side. He looks older because he is older. He's 30 years old when he dies in Vietnam. I'll read, one of my readings from the book will be the introduction to his chapter. He was one of those guys who enlisted long before Vietnam was Vietnam, 1953. And he was in the Army almost 13 years when he died in Vietnam. And I'll talk about how he died because it's kind of shocking. Married, 4 kids. He's 30 years old. His oldest daughter is 11. And his youngest daughter, when he went to Vietnam, was probably about 3 months old. He'd been allowed to stay home. They lived just outside of Fort Lewis, Washington, in Olympia. He stayed home for the birth of his daughter. And then he got rerouted, did not join his unit. He was placed in another unit as a replacement troop. The next man over is Specialist 4, Jerry Allen. Jerry Allen was drafted. There's a mixed history here. Small infant, a son. No, he has a daughter. He has a daughter who's about a year old when he goes into the Army in 1966. I talk about this in the book. I don't quite understand why he was drafted. Married with a child, had a job. Both he and his wife worked. Maybe there just weren't enough eligible guys in Madison County to draft besides him. I don't know, but that's what happened. He never questioned it. His dad was a World War II vet. His stepfather was a World War II vet, so he went and did his duty. The third man over there, the white hat, 8 of these 9 guys are Army. He's Navy. And it says Commander Thomas Sherrick is his name. He's a carrier pilot. Oh, in the parlance of the Navy, he's a stud when it comes to being a pilot. He did not go to Vietnam until he was 35. He had been in this is kind of almost stereotypical. He was married and had 4 kids. In the early 60s, he wrecked a sports car. And he thought he'd never fly again. His legs were busted up pretty bad. He worked for 2 years, got his master's degree in mathematics, courtesy of the Navy, and then had to work hard at physical therapy and all that, recertify as a carrier pilot. And so he didn't go to Vietnam until he was 35. He was an instructor back in Virginia Beach, Virginia, at that air station. And he told his wife, you know, the people that I'm teaching in the classroom, they're going to Vietnam. I've never been there. I have to go. Okay, she understood. One of the things about him, of course, is that he flew off the USS Enterprise on March 1st, 1968 with the guy right next to him was his bombardier navigator in this A6 Intruder they were flying. They were supposed to attack some NVA barracks over North Vietnam, and they never returned from that flight. It was his first mission. They never returned. So he became MIA.
Have they ever found any remains?
They have not found him. He's still officially MIA. I'll talk more about that in detail. But no, he's still officially MIA, and I'll read the end of that chapter, which addresses that topic. I had great sources. I had at least one family member for every one of these guys, which I did not think I would find a family member to talk to. And then they refer to me to other people. And the person I talked to about Tom Sherrick was his son, Tom Sherrick Jr., who lives in Virginia Beach still. So, next man over there is Gerald Meisinger, known by Jerry, everybody. I was able to talk to his brother, Don. There were 2 boys in the family. Don was not much younger than Jerry. Jerry was class of 66, Norfolk High class of 66, or 65, excuse me, and Don was 66. One of the things that happened when I contacted Don, he told me I've got 25 or 30 letters my mother saved from Jerry in Vietnam and some photos. And he lived in Texas, but he said, I don't know how I'm going to get these copies of this to you through the mail. I said, you've got an iPhone? Yeah. And so he just took pictures of everything and sent it to me, and I'd blow it up and read the letters. Great source. That's what I was hoping for, those kinds of sources. And with Jerry Meisinger, I had it. And he had I was told by his friends, he had a great sense of humor. In fact, one guy was very blunt. He said, Jerry was a real smartass, and I really liked him for that. You know? You think of the high school boy's humor. Yeah, okay. And that comes across in his letters. This is not a good picture, but it's the only one I could get of Army Sergeant Jerome Chandler. Oh, incidentally, Tom Sherrick joined up at the age of 19 in 1953, and he went from Norfolk, where he'd just gone through 2 years of Norfolk Junior College, and he got to go to Pensacola, Florida. He was a farm kid. Can you imagine that? So he was living his dream, really was. Jerry Meisinger was going to college, didn't much care for college, and he felt strongly that he should go to Vietnam, he should go into the services. And so he forgot about his deferment and volunteered for the draft. Jerome Chandler, different story. Jerome Chandler was born in Norfolk, and then his family moved to Omaha, and he was actually in Omaha when he was drafted by a judge, if you know what I mean. Yeah. He came from a very dysfunctional family. I talked to his sister, and she was telling me things that I wasn't sure I could use, very personal stuff in a general way. And Jerry rebelled. This when they were in Omaha. And he got in a lot of trouble. And eventually the judge said, this is enough. You're going to jail or you're going to go into the Army. And he went in the Army and thought, well, I'll get through this. And then he loved it. His sister said he told me when he was home on leave one time, this is exactly what I needed. I needed discipline. I needed structure. I needed someone who respected me. So he would have been, had he not died in Vietnam, he would have been probably a 20-year man in the Army. This is Army Sergeant Claude Van Andel. '76 graduate of Norfolk Senior High School.
66.
He's probably the most well-known of these 9. His story's been told across the state. On Nebraska ETV, they did a short feature on him. It's kind of I don't know if you've seen those programs. I think they're called Nebraska Stories. And usually it's done sort of almost in cartoon format. It's so his story is pretty well known in terms of his service in Vietnam. He was one of those also was going to junior college and then about halfway through, I think it was his second year, maybe his first year. I'm trying to think, probably his first year. He and some of his buddies decided to go join the Army. We'll all join together. And they did. Had an interesting experience. A lot of surprising things happened in the course of researching and writing this book, but one of them happened in June. After I went to the Memorial Park, my brother and I and his wife and my sister and brother-in-law, we all went to a cafe. We'd never been to this cafe, we walk in, we're ordering lunch, and a gentleman and his wife walk in, and my brother's a very friendly guy, if you know him. I'm more of an introvert, but he had a shirt on that indicated he was a Vietnam veteran, so my brother goes over and talks to him, figuring that he's probably just coming from the park as well. And as they begin to talk, this guy knew Claude Van Andel. He was from where, Osmond, was it?
Yeah.
And Claude would go up there in the summer times. He had a cousin or something, and he would help bale hay. And also drink a lot of beer. And they were good friends. And he said we went to basic training together, and he was my bunkmate. I can't remember who was on the bottom. I would imagine he was kind of a big guy. He probably was on the bottom.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wish I would have known that, and I could have talked to him about this book I was doing. But that was kind of surreal. The other thing about Claude Van Andel is he's well known is because the man who became the founder of The Wall, in fact, that's now his email address, founderofthewall.org, Jan Scruggs. So you're familiar with his name. He's pretty famous now. Jan Scruggs was an 18-year-old private who was ordered forward after this as his battle began to subside, and he helped to place Claude Van Andel's broken body into a body bag. And he knew who he was. He didn't know him very well, but he knew who he was. And I talked to him for this book briefly and read his book. To Heal a Nation is Jan Scruggs' book that he wrote a long time ago. If you haven't read it, it's a moving story. Very good. Took a lot of tenacity to get that wall built. In the middle here is Army Sergeant Roger Hunt. Hunt was a draftee. He got out of high school in 1968. I remember Roger. A lot of smiles. He smiled all the time. Good sense of humor. Good guy. And Roger went to work for the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which was probably the best blue-collar job in the town, Norfolk, at that time. I called it in the book, I called the Chicago Northwestern as the Hunt family business. Roger's father worked for the railroad. 3 of his uncles worked for the railroad. His grandfather was an engineer, so they kind of had it tied up there, right? But this was going to be his lifetime job, I'm sure. He's going to be promoted up through the ranks. That was the plan. He was also 1A. And he was drafted. And of course, I had a great source, his brother Bruce. He said there was no question he was going to go. Of course you go. That's what you do. I'll talk more about Roger later, but yeah, he was one of the draftees, but he did not resent it. He had a very positive outlook about everything in life. The next man over, Stephen Struby. Struby was also drafted by a judge. He got into a lot of trouble, but when you read the chapter, you'll find out one of the things that happened to Steve Struby was when his father was just 42 years old. They lived in O'Neill. His father battled diabetes his entire life, and his father died when his father was 42 when he died, and left a wife and 4 kids, 4 boys, and Steve was one of them. They moved to Norfolk. I was able to talk to 2 of the 4 brothers. It was tough without their dad. Their mother wasn't much of a disciplinarian. I think the dad had played that role, and he was gone. And so Steve and his older brother got into all kinds of trouble with the law. The 2 younger ones didn't because they knew what it was like to get in trouble with the law by watching their older brothers, right? And Steve was eventually sent to Kearney Reform School. He got out. I remember him in Norfolk High when he was there a little bit. But when he got out, he got a job, and then he got in trouble again. In fact, that's the introduction to the chapter on Steve Struby, is how he got in trouble. I talked to the guy who they got in trouble together. They both ended up going to the service. But he's the youngest of these 9 men. When he dies in Vietnam, he's a couple months short of his 19th birthday. He's just 18. Another quick story about Steve, he was sent to West Germany. And he got bored in West Germany. He was like guarding a missile silo or something like that, his brother said. He couldn't quite remember. And so he was a big car enthusiast. A lot of guys were back then, hot rods, you know, build your own dream car. He saw an ad for a souped up Camaro, and he had to have it. And he was going to get a bonus if he went to Vietnam. And so he went to Vietnam to get that bonus money. I think it was $10,000, which was more than enough to buy this Camaro. When he came home, before he went to Vietnam, of course, came home from West Germany, he was starting to have big second thoughts. His brother said he was not like himself. He said Steve partied, but he partied every day when he was home. It was and he kind of felt like he wasn't coming back. One of the sources I was able to talk to about Steve Struby was a tank commander who was 2 vehicles behind Steve's APC when Steve drove over a mine and was killed. It's kind of amazing that we could find people like that, but I put messages on unit message boards on the internet, thinking I'd never hear from anybody. Nobody looks at these things, right? And a number of sources popped up. Yeah, I knew Steve Struby. Then the last individual, I'll talk about Mike Wimoff a little bit more as I do some readings in the book. Mike was, he's the only member of the 9 people, he's the only member that was in a rock and roll band. I talk about that because two of the other founding members were his brothers, younger brothers. And Greg is still around. I talked to Greg, and they had a lot of good stories. I talked to one of his bandmates from Verdigris. A lot of good stories. So that's part of the book. And Mike was a little older. He wasn't your average draftee. He was several years before he was drafted out of high school. But he was a draftee as well. So do you have any questions, comments? At the end of this, we'll open it up once again. But if you have any questions, just raise your hand. And he went to Norfolk Catholic, Joe. Right, Joe? Yeah. Okay. Now I'm going to attempt to share parts of the book with you. Some of you might be asking, what about the book? Okay, here it comes. Can you hear me? Do I need to? I haven't used the mic much in my life. The catalyst for the book really came to me fall of 2017. I watched the PBS series. Some of you watched it, maybe all of you did. The Vietnam War, Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's epic documentary. And I know some people took issues with parts of it. I thought it was great. First big epic documentary I watched Ken Burns make was baseball. That was like 12 hours. I started watching that and I thought, you know, I remember looking at a list of guys from Norfolk who died in the war. I wonder if I can find that again, and I found it almost immediately. There's lots of stuff online. Some of you have done some of that research, I'm sure. Oh my gosh, you know, there's just all kinds of stuff. So I found a list of these 9 guys. And some of them I had no clue who they were. I barely remembered their name from the first time, like 5 years before that, I looked at the list. And so I thought, well, I'm going to see what I can find on the internet. And I found out I could find quite a bit. And after a while, I had files on each of them. I had so much material, I thought, I wonder if any of their family and friends are around. And they were. And one thing I did was I got a subscription to whitepages.com. So some of this was cold call. I called guys, and they're like, who are you? What are you doing? And I had to, in 30 seconds, get their trust so they didn't hang up on me, right? But that's what you're looking for. You're looking for friends and family if you can find them, not just documents off the internet. And I was able to find them in every case. Some of the chapters are not as long as others, but there's more source materials. I talked about my singer's brother furnished me with 25 to 30 letters home. Claude Van Andel, his sister, furnished me with about 25 letters home. You really get into their personality, exactly where they're at, what they're doing. Very valuable stuff. So those chapters are longer than the others. But it all began to coalesce into information. Enough information, I thought, I've never written a book, maybe I could write a book about this. And of course, part of it was the teacher in me came out. I should tell other people these stories. They deserve to be known. These guys do. And so I started, it took me 4.5 years, but I finished the book in December of 2022 and had it printed, the first printing in January 2023. So that's how the book came about. There were times I was ready to give up because I would hit a roadblock, information that I knew would be crucial, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Or you call somebody and they don't call you back, and then you email them and they don't email back, and you think, well, this person doesn't want to talk to me, and then suddenly they call you up or email you and say, yeah, you know, Dennis Anderson, who was kind of the guy I first started digging into, this is in chronological order, of December of '66. I found his daughter, this was kind of a desperation move, but I found his daughter on Facebook. I knew who his kids were because I had the funeral notes from the Norfolk Daily News. I went to Norfolk and did some research in their library. And they had the Norfolk Daily News digitized in there. And so, I'll see if this person's on Facebook. And they were. Annette Anderson Thompson. But she kept her maiden name in there. And then I looked at her photos, and here's a photo of her dad. And underneath it, she's inscribed Sakanja Lakota. Oh, I already knew that he was Native American. He was Sakanja Lakota. And by that time, I knew he'd been born on the Rosebud Indian Reservation in 1936. So I knew some things, and I think that helped me when I began talking to her. She was very wary of this guy from Montana on the phone, you know, or the email, I guess is how we communicated. And your mother was very wary as well. But for some reason, they trusted me, and soon more information started coming until I could do a decent job on telling his story. So that's how it began. I think if we look at my notes, I think I've covered it. One of the places I started research on the internet was, obviously you can't see this. If you can, you've got great eyes. It's called the Caulfield database. Has anybody ever looked at the Caulfield database? You just type in, Google in Caulfield database, and up pops up a page, and you type in the name of the person you're interested in, and up pops up a summary page that shows you service records and National Archives records have all been combined into one summary. And this is where I started. And I won't go through the whole thing because I don't have my glasses on. These things, right? Hometown of record, Norfolk, Nebraska, birth date, death date, age of death, remains, recovered, burial, Olympic Memorial Gardens, Tumwater, Washington. And then it has military data. So I'm going down through the military data. These are artillerymen. He's a cannon crewman. He was actually a section fire chief. So he was in charge of a battery of guns. Casualty data, non-hostile, died outright from other causes. Second category, accidental homicide. Ground casualty. That caught my attention. Accidental homicide, what does that mean? Later in my research, it seemed like years later, but it was actually probably weeks later, I asked his daughter, I felt like I had got enough trust invested in her, or in me, I guess. And she said, well, I'll send you an email. I wondered that too. And for years I wondered that. She was 7 when her dad died in Vietnam. And I think she got onto a unit website and just said, my dad he was died this day, accidental homicide, does anyone know the specifics? And somebody responded who was there. And I'll tell you about that. First I'm going to read the introduction to the chapter to kind of introduce you to Dennis Anderson, who he was. And then I'll talk about what this man told Annette about her daughter's death. Each chapter starts with that picture. So I'm just going to read the first paragraph. Chapter 1, Dennis W. Anderson, panel 13E, road 31. What's that a reference to? Panel, road. Any idea? Wall. The wall. If you've been to the wall, even the replica walls, the moving wall, you know there's 58,000 plus names on it. Where are these guys? They have a directory. So each chapter starts with the name of the serviceman and the place on the wall where you can find them. So it's a foreshadowing. You already know they died in Vietnam. This emphasizes it. On February 3rd, 1954, Dennis Anderson and his friend Everett White walked into the local recruiter's office at the Norfolk Federal Building and enlisted to serve in the United States Army. Dennis and Everett, affectionately called Bunky and Punk by family and friends, had known each other for years. They had grown up just 2 blocks from one another on Burgess Avenue, a poor neighborhood of small homes and shanties populated by whites, Native Americans, and the town's lone African-American family. This was an opportunity to serve their country, to step out of small-town Nebraska, to earn a regular paycheck. For Anderson, there was undoubtedly one more reason: the Army was in his blood. The great-grandfather had served as a scout on the northern Great Plains in the 1800s. His father had served as a hitch during World War II. 5 of his mother's brothers had enlisted as well. One of his uncles, Sergeant Enoch Jack Raymond, had been killed in Italy during the last year of the war. Now it was Anderson's turn to do his duty, and in early February, he and White boarded the bus for Fort Riley, Kansas, in basic training. So that's how he began. He quit school halfway through his junior year. It was interesting because I didn't think this would happen, but I asked Norfolk High for the grade cards for each of these guys who went to Norfolk High, and they gave them to me. I guess there's a, so then let that be a warning if you graduate from Norfolk High. But his grades had been fine up to his junior year, and then they kind of went to hell, and he decided to go in the Army. Now, I mentioned this accidental homicide that kind of stopped me in my tracks. One of the first things you think, because of publicity, is fragging, right? He'd been intentionally killed by another soldier, even though it said accidental, they were covering up, and all that kind of mindset. I thought, no, let's just wait for the evidence, because there are accidents. There are a lot of guns and rifles around, right? That there could be a problem with that. So eventually, Danette sent me an email that had a link on it, and I found the story that she had found out. So I'd like to read that paragraph. Staff Sergeant Dennis Anderson died at Camp Inari on Sunday, December 11th, 1966, waiting in reserve to be called into action. The details of his death can be found in an email to Anderson's daughter, Danette, dated August 2009. So that's how long she had to wait. 2009 to find out how her dad died in 1966, specifically. Danette Anderson was just 7 years old when their father died in Vietnam. She understood that he'd been accidentally shot by a U.S. soldier, but wanted to know more. Jack Stewart, the XO of Battery B, responded to her request for more information. Quote, "I remember very well the incident of SFC Anderson's death," that's Section Fire Chief. He wrote, "About mid-morning on the 11th, Anderson was being given a haircut by our battery medic when an infantryman on the perimeter accidentally discharged his weapon." End quote. The errant round struck Anderson in the head, and he died instantly. In his email, Stewart apologized for not remembering more about Anderson. "I wish I could add something else for Anderson's family, but he was with us a very short time. Anderson was one of 3 4th Battalion 42nd Field Artillerymen who died that December." So there was nothing sinister about it. It was an accident. And that's, 2009, she found out those details. Do you have any questions about Staff Sergeant Anderson? He served in Alaska for 2 years, in West Germany 2 tours, and then, as I mentioned before, he went to Vietnam as a replacement troop after his unit went over there in July, and he didn't go until the fall because he was waiting for the birth of his daughter, Patricia. So, one of the other things that I haven't said yet is that in talking to the families, it's obvious there's still great pain associated with these deaths. And it really affected them still today. In Anderson's case, the two younger kids were 4 and 3 months old. They have no recollection really of their father, but long, except for photographs where they're with him. And then the two older ones, the oldest one has had real trouble, and then her father's death over the years. And Jeanette's in her 60s now. Her older sister is about my age, old, real old. So. When I was doing the book, there were a number of surprises along the way. I mentioned people calling me or emailing me who I didn't even know, but somehow they knew I was writing this book about their friend or someone they served with. And so that happened on a number of occasions. Sometimes I thought I was done with a chapter. And then 5 months later, I have to rewrite this part. I have to add this. And like I mentioned earlier, the guy from Osmond, I wish I would have known him when I was writing the thing about Claude Van Handel. I'm going to tell you about just two stories. They're examples of these surprising developments. And one is about Michael Wimhoff, the last of these 9 guys to die in Vietnam. First, I need to explain, for the reference for the conclusion of this chapter, I need to explain how he was drafted into the Army. In '68, he graduated from Norfolk Catholic. He was working with a fellow who also was a Norfolk Catholic graduate. They went to 12 years of Catholic school together, but didn't really know each other that well. And then they became really close friends that summer, somehow. And Mike convinced this other guy, that Bart Tillotson was his name, that they should join the Navy together. Now this was '68, and you know what's happened in '68, right? Mike's dad had been a CB in the Pacific during World War II and was twice wounded there. So that's why he chose the Navy, I'm sure. So they do the paperwork and they go into Omaha for their physicals. Bart passes his physical, and immediately he's in the Navy. Mike failed his physical. He had a hernia. He didn't know it, but he had a hernia. And so the Navy said, okay, here's what we'll do. If you want to be in the Navy will do the surgery to fix your hernia. They'll give you adequate time to recover from that surgery. Then you go to basic. And all the time this is happening, that will count towards your time, your enlistment time, and you'll be paid. And of course, the hospitalization and the surgery, that's all on us. So you can do that, or you can go back home. And Bart was not real happy when Mike decided to go back home. He went back to Norfolk. And he resumed playing in this band, Third Stone from the Sun. And he also, by that time, had a pretty good job in Norfolk. So Bart went on to have a 20-plus year career in the Navy. And Mike went home. And I think Mike thought, well, that's it for me. I don't have to worry about the draft. And unfortunately, he was considered a 1A. I don't know if somebody didn't get the message about his hernia, but the following spring, as he was preparing for a June wedding with his 18-year-old fiancée, he had met her at a dance in South Dakota where his band played. I should probably tell him the name of the band, don't you think, Joe? Third Stone from the Sun. What a name, right? 60s name. Third Stone from the Sun, which is a Jimi Hendrix song, and they took it for themselves, right? I guess they were kind of a loud garage band type. Not real disciplined, I guess, but kids liked them, up in South Dakota especially. Anyway, so that's what he was doing when he got a notice from the Madison County Draft Board, and he was drafted into the Army. So he didn't have a June wedding. He went to basic training, went through AIT, came back home. He and his fiancee wed in October of 1970. 2 weeks later, he went to Vietnam. That, you know, if you think about that, that's an unusual way to get into the Army. So I'd like to read a little bit about Mike's choice. I guess that's his choice to go back to Norfolk. And a conversation I had with Bart Tillotson about Mike's choice. And also, I visited the cemetery where Mike is buried. It's a lot of Wim Hofs in that cemetery. I have to put this down for a second. So this is my thoughts as I left the cemetery. Just outside of Humphrey, Nebraska, it's a small rural cemetery next to an inactive Catholic church. And I would say a third of the cemetery, the headstones read Wim Hof, right? I returned to my truck and drove slowly back to the highway, thinking of another conversation. Bart Tillotson was not able to attend Mike's funeral, but he has visited St. Mary of the Angels. Quote, when I came back to Norfolk to visit my mother, I often went down to talk to Mike's dad, and several times he had driven down to the cemetery to visit Mike as well. There was sadness and regret in Bart's voice. I couldn't help but think of that time in 1968. I wonder what would have happened if Mike had joined the Navy, if he hadn't been drafted into the Army. It's just something that I think about. Bart Tillotson spoke from the heart, but his reasoning was sound, supported by facts. 83% of all U.S. casualties during the Vietnam War took place during infantry combat operations. Of the 58,220 deaths in Vietnam, 46,620 occurred in combat, and the Army Marines accounted for 95% of that total. Furthermore, as the war progressed, draftees made up an ever greater percentage of troops killed in action. In 1965, for example, draftees made up just 16% of battlefield deaths. By 1970, that figure rose to 43%. Had Mike opted to enlist in the Navy, as he had originally planned, it's much more likely that he would have survived a tour of Vietnam. In retrospect, Mike's choice may have cost him everything, but he was not alone when it came to life and death decision-making. During the course of the war, millions of young men faced similar prospects: to enlist, to present themselves for the draft, to seek some sort of deferment, or to leave the country they called home. Their decisions were subject to laws and policies enacted by Congress and enforced by the Commander-in-Chief. In Michael Wim Hof's case, someone, whether a nameless Army bureaucrat or the local Selective Service Board, revisited his file and decided that he should be drafted. What had changed in Mike's situation that would justify such a move? It is hard to know, for at times who was drafted and who was not was something of a mystery. And you guys can all attest to that, right? You knew people that weren't drafted, it was like, or were drafted. Yeah. There were rules and guidelines, but there also seemed to be exceptions. Was it reasonable for Mike to think that he was no longer subject to the draft? Mike Wim Hof was surprised by the Army's decision to draft him a year and a half after he'd failed his physical. Nonetheless, he did not challenge his call to serve. He was, after all, the son of a World War II veteran, and his mother worked in the defense plant, the ammo plant down in Grand Island. She made bombs during World War II and also during the Vietnam War. With Joe Ellen, he rearranged their wedding plans, then reported for basic training. It all happened so fast. An engagement, a draft notice, a wedding postponed, followed by boot camp. In October, Mike and Joellen reunited for their wedding vows. Then Mike was gone, flying to South Vietnam. Off, 20 years old at the time of his death, was one of 396 Nebraskans to lose their lives in Vietnam. I've been told this is a sad book, but there's a lot of funny stuff in it too. But yeah, it is a sad book. My sister Chris helped as an editor on this book. My brother also helped me. She's an impatient sort of person. I think it was the first year I was writing this book, and she called me up and said, "Have you got a title yet?" And I didn't have a title, and but I said to her, after writing 3 chapters, I said, a story of a collection of sad stories. That's the way it was making me feel to do the research and write, even though there are some funny things in here. In Mike's chapter, of course, the tales about being in the band are pretty interesting. So, another person I'd like to talk about and just read a little bit. How are we doing on time?
I think you're out of time.
I'm out of time. Oh, boy. Okay. Well, thank you. You've been a very attentive audience. I didn't know what I was going to do if somebody fell asleep, but I was told you guys would be alert. And you were. I thank you very much. If you'd like to talk to me more, I can certainly go out and talk. I guess we'll have to move the books out somewhere. If you'd like to buy a book, they're $20. And I'll sign it for you if you want to do that. But I need to get out of here, don't I? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.